It's actually important to look at the banking information in context, right? And I think there will always be people who want to read articles about whether banks are going to require more full-time in office. So it's an attractive article to write, and people get excited to read it for a lot of different reasons. In practice, if you look at the three banks that they highlight, for Barclays, it's similar. They're exploring full-time in office for 530 people out of 220,000 people. So I don't think it's actually emblematic of a big shift at those banks in culture or strategy. I think they're looking at and saying, hey, look, we've got a bit of a regulatory extra paperwork. Because in practice, what the FINRA change means is if you are working remotely, you have to every 3 years, I think, do a almost like a take a step to review and make sure that it complies with policy and that security is where it's supposed to be. And there's a little bit of headache for a bank to do that. And so they're saying, hey, look, well, for some of these folks, maybe we'll bring them back instead. So I don't think for those companies in particular, it's reflective of some broader shift toward full-time in office. I think it's actually pretty localized. Broadly across the US, we're seeing a trend away from full-time in office. So we started tracking this data in the beginning of 2023. So we've been able to look longitudinally by quarter. So from Q1, Q2, all the way through to now Q2 2024. So it's been about 15 months or so that we've been able to look at it. When we first started looking at this across the US, it was about 50-50. So 49% of companies required full-time in office for corporate employees. 51% offered at least some level of flexibility for employees. Now, as of our most recent report, which we put out about 2 weeks ago, 69% of companies offer work location flexibility. Only 31% are full-time in office for corporate employees. So while there's always some visible examples, and anytime a company changes policy to 5 days a week, it gets lots of headlines. In practice, what's happening, if you look at thousands and thousands of companies, is actually a pretty steady shift toward more hybrid work as the dominant model. Interestingly enough, I wouldn't characterize it as a shift away from the office full time for companies that already have a policy to be full time in office. So, what I mean by that is through 2023 and in the first few months of 2024, it is not that we've seen a lot of companies that were once full time in office say, okay, we're abandoning full time in office and we're going hybrid. Actually, what's happened is at the beginning of 2023, there are a lot of companies who had not set a policy yet, and they were waiting on the sidelines to see what were companies going to do broadly. Was there going to be a big return to office? Was everyone going to go back in full time? Through 2023, the data showed it was pretty flat. We weren't seeing a meaningful pickup in return to office rates. We were still seeing in our data an average about 2.5 days a week spent in the office. And over the course of the last year and a half, all of those companies, or I shouldn't say all, but most of those companies have come off the sideline and actually set their policy. And overwhelmingly, that policy has been hybrid. So as more and more companies do that, it changes the picture of what's happening across the US. And it's reflecting that more and more companies of all sizes, from small to large, are actually opting for hybrid models versus picking full-time and office models. I think the takeaway for an HR executive is this is a fast moving topic. I think that you're going to see continued ebb and flow in terms of push around work location flexibility and pull around work location flexibility. And companies are going to increasingly look to, for lack of better description, de-average the way that they approach this. I think that there was a period of time early in the pandemic where companies were very monolithic in the way they described what the policy is. I want everyone in the office on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then started to shift away from specific days toward, okay, maybe we want more of a minimum model, and allowing departments or teams to customize that a little bit based on their needs. In some ways, it's not so different from, even if you're a company and your corporate policy is 2 days a week, you're still going to have maybe facilities team members or people who work on servers that are on premises and you have to go in. There are certain jobs that will always have different types of responsibilities based on what they do and what's conducive to enable them to work. This is a regulatory driven one, and there's some debate as to whether the regulation really requires it, but either way, it's causing some banks to rethink the way they approach it. And I think that type of thing will continue, where you'll say, okay, look, there are certain roles that need to be on site more for a particular reason, or other roles where flexibility is applied slightly differently or customized differently at the last mile. Where it becomes challenging, I think, for HR executives is making sure it feels fair in that there's like clear reasons why maybe a policy applies differently to one group versus another, or to one location versus another, because you don't want to make it feel like there are haves and have nots. And so the communication around it and making sure that the thought process around it is clear, I think is important. But I would be surprised if we don't see more of this in the future of, hey, there are different groups or different populations that have slightly different needs or responsibilities. And as a result, flexibility is just going to apply to them in a slightly different way. If I'm an HR executive thinking about this topic, I know that it's going to continue to come up. I'm going to hear it from board members and CEOs and others around policy. I also know it's important to employees to have flexibility. I think the data on that is quite clear over time across lots of different data sources. So the best thing you can do as an HR executive is to have a really clear point of view on why you as a company do what you do, which is a combination of internal data. How do we work? What's the feedback from our employees? How are we operating? That type of stuff. And benchmark. Yes, this one company changed policy, but here's Flex Index data that shows 1,000 companies like ours and what the mix looks like. And this is where we're at in that. And if you're an HR leader and you have a good balance of internal data and external data, it's a good way to build credibility and answer those types of questions when they come up internally.